Alright, so we left off last time in the last video with blood flow and how blood flows to the heart. And so here is just a picture that shows some of the external anatomy, like your aorta and your descending aorta here, along with this internal anatomy. And it also shows a nice schematic image of a gap junction, and it's a nice histology of what an actual intercalated disc would look like with the mitochondria latent. Like I said last time, your cardiac muscles have a lot of mitochondria in them because that's really not an area that you want to run out of ATP, that you want to run out of energy. And you can see the sort of branching. You can see the sort of branching that takes place here with this cardiac muscle. And this is again just a way to picture the blood flowing through the heart. A couple of videos that talk about this already, so I'm not going to continue repeating myself, but there it is. So, how do the structure of the vessels and heart match their functions? And as you know, since you should, by the time you're watching this, kind of understand the directionality of blood flow through the heart, you should know that the right ventricle is just pumping blood to the lungs, right? It's just pumping blood to the lungs, whereas the left ventricle has to pump blood to the entire body. It has to pump blood everywhere. And so the left ventricle, that should be logical to you, the left ventricle is more muscular than the right ventricle. The arteries are more muscular than the veins. And this is logical as well. You should be able to kind of figure out why that might be the case. And it's the case because arteries have to withstand much higher pressure than veins do. Your arteries have to withstand this really kind of intense blood pressure from the heart pumping blood through them, and the veins do not. The veins will return blood eventually, but the blood pressure through those is much lower, and therefore veins have a thinner wall and a larger center area in order to contain blood. And your veins actually serve as a reservoir for blood. So if you were to start losing blood, your veins actually hold some blood, unused blood, in reserve so that you can get some of that back and continue living. So how does the heartbeat occur? Well, during systole, the atria contract together, followed by the ventricles contracting together. And you should remember that the atria is where the blood enters the heart. So the right atrium, the blood enters the heart. During systole, it's contracting and pumping blood to the ventricle. Then, during a process or a period called diastole, the chambers relax and the blood can come back into the heart after it's been pumped out. And this is referred to as the cardiac cycle, and it happens about 70 times a minute. Like we talked about in class, it's an average of 70 times a minute, all day, every day. It's definitely lower when you're sleeping, but anyway. So I'm going to hammer this point home again, but you need to know the directionality of blood flow through the heart. Okay, it's very important, especially for the So a few things to think about here, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse with this one. You've seen it several times. There's a video you can go back and look. But here's some nice pictures of what these valves actually look like in a heart that's been given a nice cross-sectional cut to it. And the other thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that the closing of these different valves create that lub-dub or lup-dub, if you prefer, depending on who you ask. So the semilunar valves closing makes the dub, and the atrioventricular valves closing makes the lub. And so remember, if blood is coming into the atria, and then it's being pumped into the ventricular region of the heart, That's going to be your atrioventricular, right? Going from the atrium to the ventricle. And these semilunar valves is pumping blood either out these pulmonary arteries or out the aorta to the rest of the body. So that's the duct. It's when those valves close. So heartbeat is controlled through the muscles, through the heart itself. So your brain doesn't actually have a ton to do with this. It can definitely influence it. So I'm certainly not advocating for doing this, but the heart controls its own rate. And an area called the SA node, which we're going to talk about here and in just a minute, actually initiates the heartbeat. So what I mean by this, what I mean by internal control, and the SA node initiates it, is you don't actually need your brain for your heart to beat. Your brain certainly can influence whether or not your heart is beating and the rate at which it's beating, but in theory, you could take your heart out of your body, put it into a saline solution, make sure it has plenty of oxygen, and your heart would continue beating even outside or even without being connected to your brain, which is pretty fantastic, I think. So the SA node, what I want you to know here is that the SA node initiates the heartbeat, causes those atria to contract. So it's starting with the SA node. Then the SA node is sending this impulse to the AV node, which is also in the right atrium. So both of these are in the right atrium. And that atrium sends the signal down the AV bundle into the Purkinje fibers, that cause the ventricles to contract. So the SA node starts it in the right atrium, travels to the AV node, which sends it down to the Purkinje fibers, and that causes the ventricles to contract after a moment. And the impulses travel between the gap junctions and intercalated in the intercalated discs, and that's why it's important that your cardiac tissues have so many of those gap junctions. That's why it's important that those branching muscle fibers are connected by those intercalated discs so that they can send these signals between and to one another. So like I said, the brain can have an influence on the rate at which your heart beats. There is a cardiac center, and it uses hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine and others in order to indicate to your heart, okay, well, now perhaps you should be beating faster, or, now maybe you should be beating slower, or whatever signals it's wanting to send. But the brain can have an influence as well. But I definitely want you to know that the heart can beat without a signal from the brain at all. Excuse me. Because of the way the heart is wired, because of the way the heart is set up, it can actually beat with no external communication to the brain whatsoever. So here's a picture of that stuff I just described. The SA node starts the heartbeat. This is what signals the AV node. And the AV node continues pushing this signal on down to the Purkinje fibers. All right. So the SA node starts things off, and then it sends it to the AV node, which continues propagating the signal onward. Very interestingly, if the SA node stops working for whatever reason, the AV node itself can continue the process of the beating heart. So if the SA node fails for some reason, the AV node can continue it. Now, your heartbeat will be a lot slower if it's just the AV node continuing it, but the AV node can help here. And if the AV node fails, the Purkinje fibers can also cause the heart to continue beating. They can propagate the signal. However, if it's just these fibers and no SA node, no AV node, your heartbeat will be even slower. So your heartbeat will be like 30 beats per minute. And more than likely on your next test, you're going to have a question where you have to, I don't know, maybe look at an EKG or maybe look at a pulse rate and figure out, well, what's wrong with this person? And the answer will probably be, well, there's some issue with the SA node. The SA node is not sending those signals out, and so the AV node had to take over, or the Purkinje fibers had to take over, okay? So look out for that on your next test, or maybe a quiz or something. So what is an ECG, or EKG as it's very often called? A kind of interesting side note, they call it an EKG because the person who invented it, I believe, was German, and cardio in German is spelled with a K. It's a measure of the electrical changes in the heart muscle during a cardiac cycle. So it's measuring those signals sent from the SA node to the AV node. And the atria produce an electrical current called the P wave when stimulated by the SA node. Then the contraction of ventricles is what's called the QRS complex. And then the recovery of those ventricles is called the T wave. And by looking at those, you can figure out very often if there's something wrong with the electrical signals in the heart. And we're going to look at a picture of this, and I'm going to describe all of these things again, but you should know that the atria produce this P wave. The ventricles contracting produces the QRS complex, and then the recovery or the relaxation is called the T wave. So here's a nice picture of a normal EKG. So you've got your P wave here, then you have your QRS complex, and then you have the recovery or this T wave here. Okay. So here's a close-up image of an EKG, and you've probably seen this many times on like a doctor show or something like that. But this P wave here represent the atria contracting and those AV valves, or arterioventricular valves, opening up. And then here you have this QRS complex, which represents the ventricles contracting and actually pumping blood out to the rest of the body. And then this T wave here is those ventricles relaxing, or depolarizing, however you want to think of it. And you might say, well, okay, there's ventricular, or the ventricles are relaxing. Why aren't the arteries relaxing? Why is there no wave for that? There is. It's just sort of buried in this QRS complex. So again, this is the atria producing this electrical signal here, this P wave. The QRS is the ventricles producing the wave when they contract and pump out blood. And then this T wave is the ventricles actually relaxing. So here's another image of the sort of the way the electrical signals are conducted throughout the heart. You have the SA node, which is going to send signals out, including to the AV node, through these things called the bundle of His, which I'm not as worried about right this minute, but it's a good thing to know, called these bundles of His, which propagate the signal, which propagate the signal throughout the rest of the heart. So I would definitely know the heartbeat signal starts in the SA node, travels through the AV node, and then eventually down to those Purkinje fibers. So much like we discussed and went over and worked with and studied in class, blood pressure is the pressure against the blood vessel wall, which you usually measure in the artery of the arm, just like we did with those blood pressure cuffs. And the high pressure is called the systolic pressure, and that is when those ventricles are pushing blood out of the heart into the vessels of your body. And the low pressure is called the diastolic pressure, and that's when those ventricles are relaxing and the heart is able to refill with blood so that it can pump it around through the lungs and out through your body. So systolic pressure is the pressure when blood is being ejected from the heart, And diastolic pressure is when blood is refilling the heart. The average blood pressure is about 120 over 80, and lower than that or in that range is going to be considered healthy. Much higher than that is what's going to be called hypertension or prehypertension. So I also wanted to tell you that blood pressure is controlled by your arterioles. Remember, your blood flows through your arteries into arterioles, and then from those arterioles into capillaries, from the capillaries into venules, from the venules into veins. So artery to arterial, and your arterioles have the muscular tissue around them that are going to be able to be used to regulate blood pressure. As you get older and as you're exposed to more pollution, your arterioles actually are contracting, and it becomes more difficult to actually regulate how high your blood pressure is. So again, we did this in class, so this should be a bit of a review, but this blood pressure cuff, or this sphygmomanometer, which is a hilarious name, puts pressure on your arteries until it closes them off. And so, if you're putting 180 milligrams of mercury of pressure, if you're putting 180 units of pressure, you're not going to hear anything. And when the blood is able to finally get through again, the artery is opening, and that is the high pressure region. And it's about 120. You should watch the cuff while you're listening to the sounds, and you start to hear sounds. That's the systolic or systole phase. And when sounds go away, the artery is all the way open. That is diastole or diastolic pressure. And you'll be able to hear that the sounds have gone away, and you can mark your location on your blood pressure cuff. Or not on you can just write down what your systolic and diastolic pressures are. So there are, like I was saying a moment ago, you have a hypertensive crisis, which is when your blood pressure is through the roof, and you will need emergency care for this. You're probably on the verge of having an aneurysm at this point. Then you have stage 2 hypertension, which is 160 over 100. Stage 1 hypertension, 140 to 160 over 90 to 100. Pre-hypertension, which is where I live, is 120 to 139 over 80 to 90. And the normal blood pressure here is 120 over 80. You also have something called hypotension. Hypotension, and that means that your blood pressure is lower than normal. And that is definitely not necessarily healthy as well. So, I don't want you to memorize all of these categories, but something I definitely want you to know is where the normal blood pressure range is and what these deviations mean, or what it means when your blood pressure gets high. So I want you to know that you run into hypertension when it gets high, and you run into hypotension when it gets low. And for most Americans, hypertension is a much bigger problem than hypotension. So what do I want you to know about blood flow? It's under the highest pressure in the arteries, but remember, arteries are thick, so it's going to be a lot harder for them to get busted open or to swell, which would be an aneurysm. Blood flow is much slower in the capillaries, which is, again, very important to allow time for exchange between cells in the blood. And blood pressure is minimal in the veins, but it still continues. And so here is a diagram. I don't necessarily want you to have this diagram memorized or anything like this, but it's showing the way that blood is flowing from your arteries into these arterioles, into the capillaries, out the venules, and back out the veins. And you should notice on this graph here that blood pressure is the highest in the arteries, and then it drops precipitously in the arterioles. So before it's transferring to the capillaries, blood pressure is considerably lower. Blood velocity is increasing, but your total cross-sectional area of the vessels is increasing as well. So blood is spending some time here in the capillaries. But the main thing I want you to notice is blood pressure is quite low through the capillaries, and it stays low through the venules, and through the veins. So if your blood pressure is so low in the veins, how do you keep the blood flowing? And how do you get blood back around without exerting any pressure on it? So there are a couple of different ways, the principle of which being the contraction of skeletal muscles. And I've referenced this in a previous video, but your skeletal muscles are actually pushing on the blood in your veins and causing it to come back around to the heart. All right, those skeletal muscles are causing the blood to continue, push through the veins back to the heart. You also have valves in your veins, which are different. That's depicted here, these little veins. The point of which being they're keeping blood flow in one direction. They're keeping it from flowing back, away from the heart. So there are two cardiovascular pathways inside of your body. There's the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. I've referenced both of which many times during the course of this class. But your pulmonary circuit's the right side of the heart. It brings blood from the body to the heart and the lungs. Okay? It brings blood from the body to the heart and the lungs. So remember, it's pushing these blood into the lungs, these alveoli where they're picking up oxygen and getting rid of CO2. Then you have the systemic circuit, which is principally the left side of the heart, that brings blood to the entire body, where it's able to exchange oxygen, pick up CO2, and start the whole entire system over again. So I want you to know the pulmonary system and the fact that that's involved in oxygenating blood, and the systemic system, which is involved in delivering oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body. So here is a picture of the systemic system. And you can see there's lots of stuff here, which we're going to dive into later on. Right now, I just kind of want you to see this picture and prepare yourself for learning lots of these things. You should already know a couple of these, like the superior vena cava. You should definitely already know. Jugular vein is one you may or may not know, but it's probably one that you've heard of. The external and internal jugular veins. So we're going to talk about all of these in more detail later on. So you also have one more wrinkle or one more detail to this, which is the heart's blood supply or coronary circulation. So there are small coronary arteries. Those are the ones that are on the ventral side, the ones that you see when you're looking at the model of the heart or you're looking at an actual heart. And those are supplying blood to the heart itself so that it continue pumping and doing all the cool stuff that it does. So these are small arteries that supply blood to the heart. And again, they are separate from the systemic and pulmonary pathways. They're kind of a special pathway that gets your heart blood. So you also have the hepatic portal system, and it brings blood to the liver. So it has glucose-rich blood. So if you eat a whole bunch of candy, the blood is going to transport that glucose to be uptaken or to be taken up by the liver. All right. The liver synthesizes blood proteins and stores the glucose as this chemical called glycogen, which is just kind of a more long-term storage molecule than the glucose. It keeps it out of the bloodstream, keeps the glucose out of the bloodstream as well. Having too high of blood sugar is definitely not good for you. And the liver also purifies blood coming from the digestive tract. All right, that's the basic things I want you to know. So the liver, its basic functions for you to know from this are: it is picking up amino acids, it is building proteins, it is storing glucose, and it's helping to purify blood. Okay? So after it leaves the hepatic system, it returns to the heart via the inferior vena cava. Okay, I'm going to call the video here. It's getting a little long, so watch out for more videos later on this week. But that was just a basic, kind of going into a few more things that we've been learning out, hopefully in a bit more detail.